Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you all to the second lecture of our third webinar devoted to the cultures that flourished in the Deccan, and with a more accurate title, From Konkan to Coromandel rather than Malabar to Coromandel. These webinars were possible thanks to the collaborative work between His Highness Srikantadatta Narasimharaja Wadiyar Foundation of Mysore and its president, Dr. Pramoda Devi, the Center for Islamic Studies, Cambridge University, and Dr. Vivek Gupta, and with the unwavering help of Niels Cunningham. And finally, the Deccan Heritage Foundation with the resolute support of Srikantadatta, the administrator of Greater Kingdom. There is a terrible noise.
Go ahead.
Okay. I would like to thank you all. I am Helen Phelan and one of the co-founders of the Deccan Heritage Foundation that marks its 10th anniversary, as it was instituted in September 2011. It has been a long and eventful journey for the DHF, not to mention an immensely fruitful one. Since September 2011, the DHF has made forays into the execution of several heritage conservation projects, publications, especially guidebooks to historical sites, and 2 companion books on Deccani architecture. Islamic Architecture of Deccan India, co-authored by George Michel and myself with photographs by Antonio Martinelli, were published in 2018. And the just published second volume, Temples of Deccan India, authored by George Michel with photographs by Surendra Kumar, will create a really wonderful introduction or to what the Deccan can offer as a cultural visual heritage. Other important activities are the organization of the annual lectures in prominent cities in India, conducting visits to historical sites for school students, all in an endeavor to fulfill its mandate of preserving and promoting the rich composite heritage of the Deccan. While the primary function of our conservation projects is to preserve, protect, restore, and conserve, from the very beginning, the Foundation aimed at the social dimension of these heritage programs. Great leaps were made by way of employment creation and women's empowerment, environmental protection through scientific waste disposal and rejuvenation of heritage water bodies encouraged the creations of new businesses for local residents. To these, we have to include the education regarding the importance of the Deccan monuments and their historicity. As the DHF moves into the second decade of its existence, we seek your good wishes and support in our aspirations of safeguarding and upholding the heritage of the Deccan with the help of the local populations whose heritage our efforts are dedicated to. So now let me welcome our speaker for today, Lennart Bes. Lennart Bes is an Indologist and historian studying political culture in South India. He teaches Asian history, Dutch overseas history, and archival studies at Leiden University. He has published about early modern South Indian kingdoms and Dutch sources on Asia. His book, The Heirs of Vijayanagara, Court Politics in Early Modern South India, is an important contribution to our understanding of the post-Vijayanagara era, and I'm happy that today's lecture will introduce us to the political environment of this period. Court politics in the Vijayanagara successor states, with special reference to Ikkeri, is the subject of today's lecture, and I would like to welcome Lennart Bes. The podium is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Helen. Let me start with the hardest part, and that is sharing the screen. Yeah, where is it? It's probably this one. So I hope that everyone can see the screen and that it comes between different slides. Vivek, could you confirm that?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, then I will start. First of all, I'm very honored to have been invited to give this talk. In previous years, I have attended several lectures, several presentations by the Deccan Heritage Foundation. So yeah, it's really an honor that now I can present myself. So I really would like to thank everyone, including George and John, who are sort of responsible for this and yeah, made me do this. Thanks a lot. Okay, what I will do today is discuss a part of my research that I have conducted for my forthcoming book. Helen already mentioned it. It's called The Heirs of Vijayanagara, Court Politics in Early Modern India, and it will be published in a few months. So what do I do in this book? I focus on what I call court politics, or maybe political culture, at the royal courts of Vijayanagara's successor states, the states that emerged when Vijayanagara was slowly disintegrating. And for me, this first slide that you see, which was also the image of the invitation of the announcement of today's lecture, this first slide sort of seems to sum it all up for me. Court politics in the Vijayanagara successor states, and I will return to this image at the very end. So my big question for that research, for my book, was how were the courts of the successor states, Vijayanagara successor states, related to each other and to Vijayanagara itself with regard to these court politics, political culture. And in my research, I focused on 4 successor states. You see a European map from 1733, and it shows Vijayanagara itself and some of the successors here, including Ikkeri, Madurai, Tanjavur, and Ramnath. These are the 4 courts that I focused on. And for Tanjavur, that's both the Nayakas and the Maratha Bonslays who succeeded them. So today I will look at these courts, but I will zoom in on Ikkeri. Because I like to pay special attention to Karnataka today. And basically what I do in my book is make lots of comparisons. So I compare the foundation myths of all these courts, successions to the throne, the power of courtiers, court protocol and insult, and also Islamic, or maybe I should say Islamic cut or even Persianate influences. That research is largely based on 2 kinds of sources, 2 kinds of unexplored sources, Indian sources and Dutch sources. You see an example of these 2 types of sources on this 3rd slide. On the left, you see an inscription of one of the Nayaka kings of Madurai. I apologize, I didn't have a good picture of a source from Ikkeri, so that's why it's Madurai. And on the right, you see the first page of a report of a Dutch embassy to King Somashekara Nayaka II of Ikkeri, a document from 1731. And if you look at the section that I highlighted in red, you see that it says, for His Highness, so that's the translation of this Old Dutch, for His Highness Chankara, which is the Dutch corruption of Somashekara, Nayak, and then it says Koning van Kanara, which is King of Kanara. Kanara was the name that the Dutch and also the British and the Portuguese used to refer to Ikkeri. So I use Indian sources, mostly translated manuscript collected by Mackenzie. And Mackenzie was a British colonial official in the early 19th century who collected Indian manuscripts. So I use those. And these manuscripts include chronicles, dynastic chronicles collected by the British to understand South India's past. Well, I'm very happy with this translated manuscript because it solves for me the problem of the linguistic diversity in South India. Whatever court you look at, you're always dealing with at least 2 languages, but often more, and I can't impossibly learn all of them. So I'm very happy with these translations. So these sources provide me with an internal view, you could say. Then I use the archives of the Dutch East India Company, which I will refer to from now on as VOC, which is the abbreviation of its Dutch name. So I use the VOC archives, and these provide me, let's say, with an external view of these courts. On the next image, you see a map of South India, and all the yellow dots indicate where Dutch settlements were located in South India. As you can see, there were a lot. There were actually quite a bit more than what is indicated here. And one of the settlements is in the top left of the image, which shows Basroor or Barcelor near Kundapura on the coast of Karnataka. And this is where the Dutch had a settlement from where they maintained relations with the court of Ikkeri in Karnataka. So as you can see, the Dutch had a very wide presence in South India, and they maintained close ties with all these courts, with different parties at those courts, kings, courtiers, local authorities, etc. Why were they actually in Ikkeri? For rice and for pepper. These were the two products that they were interested in and wanted to buy from Ikkeri. In the whole South India, the Dutch were mainly there for trade. I think that's important to keep in mind. This was not, let's say, a colonial situation. Nowhere in the area of the Vijayanagara successor states were the Dutch politically dominant. They were basically merchants at the coast, just interested in trade. So why did they actually collect so much information on these courts in their archives? Well, basically they wanted to know what is the political situation, who is in power at these courts, because then we know with whom we are supposed to speak, for instance, continue our special trading privileges. So the Dutch reported on political developments in order to conduct their trade in the best possible way. So these Dutch archives, these VOC archives, are full of reports, correspondence, diaries, etc., all dealing with these courts in early modern South India. So my research is actually engaging, I would say, with two discussions in the historiography of South India. One is the work by Velcheru Narayana Rao, David Schulman, and Sanjay Subramaniam, and especially their wonderful book, Symbols of Substance. And perhaps I could summarize that book in one sentence, and that would be Nayaka kingship, so kingship under the Nayakas was very different from kingship in earlier stages. Well, I think Symbols of Substance is absolutely a wonderful book, path-breaking, groundbreaking, I should say, fantastic. I partly agree, I partly disagree. I think there were also actually lots of continuities with the past. Another discussion that I engage with is the many studies of all these dynasties and kingdoms that were produced in the past decades. Let's say books like The Nayakas of Ikkeri or A History of the Nayakas of Madurai, those kind of works. And these studies mostly present these courts of the Vijayanagara successor states as harmonious and hierarchic and static. They are sort of portrayed as pyramids with a very powerful or even absolute ruling king at the top, and then lots of officials, courtiers, I call them, in fixed hierarchical positions. Well, this is a debate in historiography where I really disagree with other research. The thing is that these studies have been largely based on Indian sources. And of course, if you study Indian history, Indian sources are very, very important. But on the other hand, they also tell just part of the story. And why do I disagree? Because I think these courts were not harmonious, hierarchic, static pyramids, but they were rather competitive, fluid, dynamic arenas. And I think often the king was not this absolute ruler, but actually just one of the contenders for power. Now, what I will try to do today is actually explain to you how I came to this conclusion. So what I will do is giving you several examples from my research, and I will specifically look at three aspects of court politics. And here you see the three different aspects. I will look at successions to the throne, then I will discuss courtiers and their powers. So to me, courtiers is basically everyone at court except for the king. And at the end, I will look at court protocol and diplomatic insult. And what I will do when I discuss these three topics is each time compare Indian and Dutch sources that deal with the same event or with the same topic. And I have tried to include many examples from Ikkeri. I think I actually should say Ikkeri, so pardon me for that. But I also have included some examples from other successor states if they are, really telling, really representative for a certain event. Okay, so let me start with successions to the throne. So I would like to take you then to Ikkeri, also known as Keladi, in September 1661, because in that year there was a succession to the throne of Ikkeri. And what happened was, very briefly, that Nayaka II, who was a brother of the quite well-known Nayaka, was succeeded by his nephew, Nayaka, who was Nayaka's son. So basically, the uncle was succeeded by his nephew. Now, there are several Indian sources about this event, and one that is very representative of all these sources is the dynastic chronicle written in Kannada called Keladi Arasara from Shafali. And I must say, I feel a bit embarrassed saying Kannada words. Usually I talk to people about these things that don't even know that there is a language called Kannada, but I guess here there are lots of Kannada speakers, so pardon me for pronouncing it probably in the wrong way, but this was a chronicle written in the late 18th century. And this is an example of a text I found in a Mackenzie manuscript, so it has been translated in the early 19th century. And what does it say about this succession? It says, Venkatapati Nayak, the brother of Shivappa Nayak, was acknowledged at the Auramana, which I suppose means palace, of Bidunur, which is the capital of Ikkeri, Bednur, and he assumed the government of all the kingdom. He maintained his nephew Bhadrapa Nayak in an honorable manner, becoming his rank. He, so that's still the uncle, governed his kingdom without dread of the wicked from, and then there's a complex Indian dating, which refers to 1660 to, and then another Indian dating which refers to 1661. Then the text continues, Bhadrapa Nayak, the eldest son of Shivappa Nayak, so that's the nephew, was then acknowledged in the kingdom. He governed mildly and reputably. So what do we see here? There's actually not too much information. The whole section on this succession is quite short, but it basically presents this succession as harmonious, as peaceful, and also respectful. This version, which is also found in a few other chronicles, is basically found in all the history books that we still use. Now, apart from this version, there is also a Dutch report about this particular succession. So let's look at that one. Well, what you see here is a small part of a text in a Dutch letter from May 1662. So it's a few months after the event. And as you can see, the Dutch had a lot to say about this succession. So perhaps it was a bit more complicated than the Indian source suggests. Actually, the Dutch describe it as a very violent incident. So let's see what the Dutch wrote. I translated a little part of this letter for you, and let's read it. Oh, what does it say? So the letter says, so this is one Dutch official writing to another Dutch official. We were notified how Ventapanayak, so that's Venkatapanayaka II, the uncle, was killed by the general named Shivalingya with the help of Badrapanayak. So that was the nephew, the eldest son of the deceased Shivapanayak. And how mentioned prince was raised to the throne in his father's place. This happened, so the killing, happened because that Ventapanayak loved the single-headed reign too much. So apparently he was some kind of dictator, which not only made him forget to pay appropriate respect to the said prince, that's his nephew, and the general, but moreover, he secretly decided to take Shivalingya's life and Badrapanayak's side. So they're saying actually that the uncle, the first ruler, was actually plotting to kill his general and to blind his nephew. But they, so that's the general and nephew, observing matters were not right, wangled for so long that they found out about the secret. And seeing the approaching danger that threatened them, they resolved to make a virtue of necessity and let Ventapanayak fall into the trap that was set for them. So on September 8th last, so that's 1661, the aforesaid prince and general, both provided with a good saber, without any retinue but 2 or 3 trusted guards, moved in the morning at dawn to the palace of Ventapanayak, whom they called in his bedroom as he was waking up, accompanied by the chief counselor and a chamberlain. Grasping the betrayal, the king called for his handgun, but jumping to him, Shivalingya dealt Ventapanayak a blow on the head so heavy that he fell on the ground and vomited his soul right away. As sometimes these sources can be very poetic. The counselor and chamberlain who tried to protect the king were also hacked down. Seeing their intention accomplished as desired, they hastily commanded that the gates of the palace be closed and reinforced with trusted guards until order had been restored. So we actually have 2 very different versions of this succession. And why are they so different? What are we to make of this? Well, first of all, that chronicle that I mentioned before, that Kannada chronicle, was written under the descendants of Badrapanayaka, so by the descendants of that nephew. And of course, they were trying to legitimize the position of their branch. They were not going to write in this chronicle, well, actually, we were not entitled to the throne, but our ancestor killed his uncle and now we are on the throne. They would, of course, present another version that would explain their rule, that their rule was justified. Another thing is that the chronicle was written a century later, whereas the Dutch letter was only a few months later. Does that mean that the Dutch version is more reliable? Well, I'm not sure. The Dutch compiled these reports from hearsay. It's what they heard in the market. It's what they heard from their trading partners. It's what they heard from spies. So is it reliable? I'm not sure, but what we can say is that the Dutch had no real interest in the outcome of this succession struggle. All they wanted to know is, okay, who won the struggle? Who is the most powerful guy? And that's with whom we have to speak about our trade. What you could also say about this version of the events is that in a way it portrays the Indian voice as well, because the Dutch were not in that room. They didn't witness it. This is what they saw. This is what they heard. So in a way, it's also the Indian story. So what you can say when you compare these 2 sources, the Chronicle and the VOC letter, is that these sources are contradictory. But I think what you might conclude is that the event was almost certainly violent. And maybe all the details that we just heard about, maybe they're not accurate, but I believe that this was basically a violent succession. And this whole process is actually quite typical for successions in general. in Ikkeri and at other courts. In a way that's surprising, because many Indian texts say that kings should be succeeded preferably by a son or a brother. You find that in texts from the Mahabharata all the way up to the 18th century. But then Dutch sources, but also Portuguese, British, Jesuit, and even some local sources, explain that things didn't proceed in that way, usually. So if you look at an overview of successions to the throne in Ikkeri, in 1500 and 1763, there were about 17 rulers. Only 4 of these were adult sons or brothers of a predecessor. So this is what the Indian texts prescribed. Among the rest, there were 5 minors. So they were younger than 16 when they ascended the throne. 2 new rulers were women, the famous Chennamaji and also Viramaji. 6 of the rulers were killed, often poisoned. And also for a long time during the existence of the dynasty, there were 2 branches of the dynasty competing for almost a century. So basically what you see is that successions were not very harmonious, not very peaceful, but there was often competition between contenders for the throne with their own factions of courtiers and even with their own partners in neighboring kingdoms. So for instance, some of these succession struggles, there were pretenders to the throne that were supported by Mysore, or the Wadiyars of Mysore, or by the sultans of Bijapur. So these were moments when power relations were reshuffled, and these kings, they could play an active role, or sometimes they also would play a very passive role. Okay, so that is successions to the throne. Then let me move to the next topic, the next aspect of court politics that I will talk about, and that is courtiers and their powers. And again, courtiers in this case means basically everyone at court except for the kings. Well, if you look at the research on courtiers that is largely based on Indian sources, what you see is that there were relatively few top positions, and that these were always fixed, and that the hierarchy was also fixed. So what you often read is that there was a Pradhani, a prime minister, who was the highest minister, the highest official. Then there was a Dalavai, or sometimes in Ikkeri it's called Subanisa, which was a general, the highest military figure. Then there would be a Rajaguru or a Purohita, a royal priest, and there was often a Rayasam or a royal secretary. So the image what you often read in the books is that few fixed top positions, a fixed hierarchy, and also a lot of loyalty. So all these officials were loyal to their kings. Well, then the Dutch records regularly mention that courtiers were actually often very powerful, dominating kings, dominating courts. The letter that we just read that dealt with this succession to the throne in Ikkeri is one example of a courtier, in this case General Shivalingya, who was really dominating the court and actually was involved in killing the king. An Indian example that shows that courtiers could be very powerful. This image, it shows Krishnaraja Wadiyar, the second of Mysore, together with 2 of the Kalala brothers. One is Dalavai, so that's Prime Minister Deva Rajaya, and his brother is Chief Minister Nanja Rajaya. And this is relatively well known. The Kalala family became very powerful in early 18th century Mysore, and they dominated the kings. And I think this image really illustrates it in a very nice way, because on the left, you see the king. Okay, he sits on a throne, he has a servant, so he is officially the king. But if you look at the 2 figures on the right side, the 2 brothers, the 2 Kalala brothers, they are much bigger, they are carrying swords, they basically dominate the scene. So for me, this is a sort of subtle portrayal in an Indian source of how courtiers could actually become very powerful. So they could be very dominating. There are many other VOC documents, for instance, correspondence with courtiers, reports, lists of gifts at VOC embassies. They all suggest the same thing. They suggest that among courtiers, positions, different offices and different portfolios were often combined. And power and influence was not based just on one's function, whether you are a general or a secretary or whatever, but equally much on networks, on means, financial means, or the possession of land. It was also based on ambitions and, of course, on luck. So these positions of courtiers and the power that they held, it often changed. And this is, for instance, illustrated by a report of a Dutch embassy to Ikkeri in 1684. And it tells you how there were different court factions competing with each other, and they held different interests. So here is what VOC Ambassador Jacob Wilken had to say on competition between courtiers at the Ikkeri court in May 1685. So he wrote in his report, "We cannot conclude anything else than that the field lord," so that is Subanisa or General Krishnapaya, "has done his best with sincere intentions to advance the company's free trade." So that's the free trade that the Dutch wanted to have. "And although that lord," so that's still that general, "in our presence has displayed himself in the opposite way before the Queen," and that is Queen Chenamaji and others, "that happened in order to show that he sought not to lessen the king's revenues, which, as some troublemakers suggest, would be the consequence of the company's free trade. And we know for sure that in our absence," so when the Dutch were not present, "His Excellency," so that is still General Krishnapaya, "has made enough effort with the Queen for the benefit of the company's business to bring to reason the troublemakers or opponents, of whom the principal ones are the king's father and brother." These were actually two Chetty merchants, Mariappa and Manappa Chetty, "as well as the court's right trader, Sid Basuaya, and the Mangalore governor." So what does this tell us? It shows that there were actually different factions at court, and that they could be competing, and that they all sought to have power, and that there were specific networks that were rivaling each other. What it also shows is that people with other officers than other offices, than the ones you find usually in the secondary literature, could also become very powerful. And look at this image again. I've underlined some words. So apparently there was the king's father and brother, so relatives of the king. There was also the court's rice trader, so a kind of official court merchant. And there was the governor of Mangalore, so like a kind of local governor. Apparently, these people could all become very powerful and really have a lot of influence at the court. Another example that shows quite well how the power and the positions of courtiers could very quickly change, and that things were not very hierarchical and fixed, is the distribution of gifts during Dutch embassies to the court. Every time the Dutch would visit a court, would send an embassy, they would give gifts to the king and to also several courtiers, and they always thought about who is going to get the most valuable gifts and who is going to get less valuable gifts. So let's look at the distribution of those gifts at several embassies. So what do you see here? Distribution of gifts during VOC embassies to Ikkeri in order of value between 1668 and 1738. And unfortunately, for only 3 of these embassies, we still have the lists of gifts by the Dutch to people at the court, but still it is quite telling. So what do you see? Of course, during every embassy, the king would always get the most gifts. It doesn't mean he was the most powerful figure, but of course, the king is still the king. You give him the most valuable gifts. But if you look at the people who occupy the number 2 position, you see that in 1668, the person who got the most gifts after the king was a court merchant. During the second embassy, it was a secretary. In the third embassy, it was a chief minister. So apparently, the people who would receive the most gifts and whom the Dutch thought were most powerful, it changed. What you also see in this overview, several positions, for instance, in 1735, the person at place number 3 is the treasurer. It's not an office that is often mentioned, but apparently here this was an influential person. Basically what it tells you that the people in power, they rotated among these particular offices. A better example comes from Madurai, the Nayaka court of Madurai, with whom the Dutch also maintained very close relations. And here we have the list of gifts for 7 embassies from 1668 to 1731. And it's really interesting what you see. Again, the king, or in one case, a queen, is always in the top position. But if you look at the numbers too, you see something very interesting. You see in the first 2 years that the Pradhani is number 2, then a Dalavai, and then again a Dalavai, then a Dalavai, and then a Pradhani, and then a Dalavai. So these posts are sort of taking turns. What you also see is whenever a Pradhani is in the second place, the Dalavai is nowhere in the list. And if the Dalavai is in the second place, the Pradhani is nowhere in the list. So it appears that there was a very strong competition always between the people who held the post of Pradhani and the people who held the post of Dalavai. So the prime minister and the chief general. So for me, this is another indication of a strong competition between courtiers. Now you may ask, okay, but this is just what the Dutch thought. Did they really understand what the power relations at the courts were like? Well, what I can say is the courts always complained about the gifts. They complained that the gifts were not special enough. They complained that the gifts were not given soon enough or not often enough, or that the gifts were just the same as another king had recently received. So what was so special about this particular gift? They complained about everything. But the one thing they never complained about was the distribution of the gifts. Almost never. There was always a courtier visiting the Dutch beforehand, checking what gifts they had brought, and making sure that the distribution would be fine. And it was very rarely that they would say, well, you better give a bit more to this particular courtier and not so much to that particular courtier, because the first one is much more powerful than the other one. So it really seems that this distribution of gifts by the Dutch during their embassies really tells something about who was in power at the court. And if the Dutch were not correct, it would be corrected by the courtiers themselves. So in a way, you also see the local voice. Again, they had the Indian perspective represented in these lists. So I really would say this tells you something about power structures at the court. So again, what you see is that Indian and Dutch sources here are partly contradictory, but also complementary, because the Dutch sources provide extra information to what the Indian sources have to offer. And again, what you see here is typical for Ikkeri and typical for all the other successors. So there was ongoing competition. Factions of courtiers were linked to pretenders, to family networks, to neighboring kingdoms. So the careers of these courtiers were very dynamic. They occupied different positions simultaneously or consecutively. It also meant that their careers were often a tale of rise and fall. This also tells us that many different offices, not just the usual ones that you see in the secondary literature, could provide power. And the kings were in many ways just one of the contenders for power. Okay, well, then I will move now to my last topic, the last aspect of court politics that I will discuss, and that is court protocol and insult. Now there are several Indian texts, Indian treatises on the rules of protocol at court. They discuss the audience hall, they discuss the function of gifts, they discuss ceremonial, they discuss eloquence. These were all parts of court protocol. To give you one example, the Mana Solasa, a 12th century Sanskrit treatise, discusses the positions of courtiers in an audience hall so precisely that Dawood Ali, in his wonderful book Courtly Culture and Political Life in Early Medieval India, was able to compile a plan, a map of the audience hall, and explain exactly where everyone had to be standing or sitting. So if we zoom in a bit, the yellow circle indicates the throne with the king, orange circle indicates all his personal assistants, so a battle bearer, a whisk bearer, swordsman. Then this blue circle indicates princes, so relatives of the king, and on the right you see ministers and counselors, and you see also a priest. So they are a bit further removed from the king. And then third, in the purple circle, you see lords of the provinces and tributary lords of the marches. So this refers to lower chiefs and local governors, etc. So what does this tell you? That the distance from the king indicates someone's prominence, and also the fact whether you were allowed to sit or stand, or you had to stand. But okay, all these texts tell you very much about the rules. It doesn't tell you very much about how this protocol was actually employed in practice. And so were these rules actually followed? So this is again where the Dutch sources come in, because they had a lot of experience with court protocol in practice. They visited these embassies all the time. They exchanged numerous letters. And there's nothing to suggest that the protocol that existed between these courts and the Dutch was adapted to Dutch wishes. It was all Indian protocol. So what you see in these Dutch sources is that what they experience fits very well with the notions that are discussed in these texts. So you read about positions during audiences, you read about gifts, you read about protocol, you read about eloquence, for instance, in letters that were exchanged. But what you also read is that all these rules were either followed or actually violated. So the protocol was actually often breached. And usually that happened intentionally. And why did that happen? Because protocol was actually used to express satisfaction, and then you would follow the protocol, or to express annoyance, and then you would break the protocol. Now, to give you an example of how the Dutch experienced that, I will give an example of the role of carpets in the audience hall of Ramnath Kingdom. But what do you see here? Two images. On the left, you see a mural from the Ramnath Palace dating from about 1720, and it shows Mutu Vijaya Raghunatha Setupati, the king of Ramnath, with one of his consorts on a carpet. So a carpet indicated a special status, a special position. On the right, you see a detail of a letter from the VOC archives. It's from a diary of a Dutch embassy to Ramnath in the year 1743. It also mentions carpets. And you see the word al-katif, which is a word used by the Dutch. It's actually an Arabic word, al-katif. You also see the word kleed with a T or a D. It's Dutch for carpet. Now, so the Dutch also had a lot of experience with this role of carpets. And I like to tell you a story about the Dutch and their experience with carpets. And I will read it for you because I want to make sure I will tell the story clearly. So here we go. In 1736, the VOC dispatched an embassy to Ramnat to discuss a trade-related conflict. When the VOC ambassador appeared before the Setupati king, the king signaled with his hand that the ambassador could sit down. But no carpet had been spread out for him to sit on, even though this was a long-standing custom, as the ambassador himself remarked in his report. The ambassador was thus forced to put down a carpet of his own, which he had actually brought to place the gifts for the king on. After this meeting, the Ramnat court denied the ambassador another traditional honor, as no courtier accompanied him back to his lodging. During an intermediate visit by some officials, the ambassador expressed his amazement about the way he was treated, especially the absence of a carpet, and the officials assured him that he would be appropriately received at the following audience. When the ambassador secured his second audience with the Setupati king, however, there was again no carpet for him to sit on, and he once more had to use his own. The ambassador now became furious about this lack of respect and let the court know that next time Ramnat would send ambassadors to the Dutch, they should bring their own chairs. During the subsequent Dutch embassy to Ramnat in 1743, and that's where you see the image from here, when trade disagreements still characterized the relationship, the Ramnat court, employed similar tactics in the audience hall to show its irritations. This time, however, the Dutch ambassadors had evidently prepared themselves. After their appearance before the king and his invitation to sit down, once again, no separate carpet had been put down for them. Instead, another very large carpet on which most courtiers were seated was rolled out a little bit more for the ambassadors to sit on. But in what seems to have been some sort of counter-humiliation, the Dutch ambassadors now placed a carpet of their own, specially brought along for this purpose, on top of the courtiers' carpet. Then they sat down on their own carpet, greeted the king on behalf of the company's directors, asked the king about the state of his health, and presented their gifts. Undeterred by this action, however, neither the Setupati king nor any of his courtiers returned the compliments, neither inquiring about the Dutch ambassador's well-being nor exchanging other pleasantries. So what do you see here? This is just an example, but basically when it comes to court protocol, Indian and Dutch sources are complementary. So what the Dutch sources tell us that protocol could be used to show satisfaction or irritation. An insult was part of the game. Once again, this is the same in Ikkeri and all these other kingdoms. In Ikkeri, actually, this happened very often. Audiences for the Dutch with the Ikkeri king were often postponed. Palanquins, so these are carrying chairs that the court promised to send to the Dutch to pick them up and bring them to the court, were not sent. Ambassador Wilken, who was already mentioned earlier, was even taken hostage in the capital and was not allowed to leave. So as a counter-humiliation, when he was presented with one of the king's robes in the Gilaad ritual, he initially refused to accept it. So there was this diplomatic insult going on all the time. And sometimes the VOC also reported on insults among Indian parties, so not between the Dutch and local courts, but between courts. One example from Ikkeri concerns a border conflict in the 1750s between Ikkeri and Kannanur in the north of Malabar, which was ruled by the Ali Raja. And the VOC document informs us that Ikkeri's courtier Devappa, who was also mentioned already, had thrown a letter sent by Kannanur's Ali Raja ruler on the ground. And that was seen as a very clear message. When the Ali Raja heard that his letter had been thrown on the floor, it was enough reason for him to start attacking Ikkeri's ports. So again, the use of protocol is also a manifestation of the dynamic and very competitive court relations that I've been discussing all this while. I think I should go to my conclusions and finish my talk. First of all, one thing that I wanted to show to you is that when you combine Indian sources and external sources, in this case, the Dutch East India Company archives, you get a more nuanced image of court politics. Very obviously, both source types have advantages and drawbacks. There's a lot to say about what is wrong with the Dutch archives and also what you cannot do with Indian sources. But if you bring them together, they provide different perspectives. And sometimes they contradict one another, sometimes they complement one another, sometimes they confirm each other, but they always provide mutual context. So all these sources and all these examples and aspects that I discuss, I believe suggest that these courts, the courts of the Vijayanagara successor states, were rather competitive, fluid, dynamic arenas rather than the harmonious, hierarchic, static pyramids, which is often the image that you find in secondary literature. We have seen that within dynasties, among courtiers, and in protocol, there was constant competition, and power relations would constantly change. And kings were usually just one of the contenders in this power struggle. Of course, I should emphasize this is actually not typically Indian. Recent research into courts all over the world, courts in the early modern period all over the world, shows the same image. This is not typically Indian. It happens everywhere. But I think these conclusions have implications for India's earlier history, India's earlier historical stages, for which we only have Indian sources and no external sources. So I believe that, this picture that I have sketched of competitive, fluid, dynamic arenas actually applies to the whole of India's history. Okay, then to conclude this meeting, I would like to return that image that you have seen at the beginning, at the first slide, and also at the invitation announcement. And of course, I'm speculating here, but for me, this image sort of, sums it up. I think this image really shows an South Indian court. Again, we don't know which one, and it shows its competitive, dynamic nature. Because if you look carefully at the image, in the middle, you see the king on his throne with two courtiers, and they seem to listen to the king. So there is this kind of obedience or loyalty, or that's the image that the feeling that you get. So this is code green. Now look at the two courtiers at the left. They are actually focusing on each other. Do they have a conflict? Are they plotting something? We don't know, but they seem to be ignoring the king. They're not actually listening to the king. So vote yellow. Then look at the two guys at the right. Courtiers, they are literally, and maybe also they're literally behind the throne. They're also on a higher level, and they're unnoticed by the king. So I would say perhaps these two stand for all these courtiers that were active at those courts, and that strove for power and that often tried to dominate the king. So that is vote red. Okay, here I would like to stop. Dhanyavada, I hope I pronounced it correctly. Thank you for your attention. My last slide is my forthcoming book. If you're interested, you know what it's called and what it looks like. And you also see my contact details. Everyone is always very much welcome to contact me. Thank you again for your attention.
Thank you so much, Lennart, for that wonderful and wide-ranging lecture. It was really a joy to get into the very nitty-gritty details of Nayaka period politics. And so we're starting to get some questions, but I'll just ask one preliminary question just to get us warmed up. Is what, I mean, I've been familiar with the architecture of the temples in Ikkeri, particularly some of the fantastic rider imagery, these Portuguese horse riders that we see on the temples. And I wonder what the work of art historians, such as Anna Seastrand or even Anna Della Piccolo, how their work has also engaged you in navigating the court politics of this period. Clearly, you're engaging some visual sources. I mean, I know that Jos Gommens has just published an article on that textile,
Right.
But I wonder whether or not there's evidence from the physical spaces in the regions that you've been working on.
Yeah, I've been using visual materials as much as I could. I've been looking at paintings and kalamkaris and statues. They were mostly relevant for the chapter in my book on Islamic influences. I would say they were, less relevant for the things I talked about today. Although, for instance, that image that I showed of that Mysore text with the two Kalale brothers is really quite telling. Yeah, so I've been trying to involve art historical sources, and I've been also bothering art historians, including both Annas, and asked them, to help me interpret these images. But yeah, not so much, I would say, in general for the topics I discussed today.
Okay. While we are on the subject of the visual, which Stephen Cohen says the carpet in the Ramnad mural is not a carpet in the conventional sense. It is a covering of some sort, since this is on a throne, not on the ground or under the throne. So thank you, Stephen, for that wonderful clarification.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, then maybe I misinterpreted that. But I guess it doesn't matter that much. Basically, what I wanted to show is that the position in the audience hall is very important. And for instance, whether you are allowed to sit or stand. So let's say if you're a Dutch ambassador and you appear before the Setupati king, and he tells you to sit down, but then there's no carpet. That is, I would say, that's clearly a message. It's clearly a diplomatic insult. So maybe that image doesn't really show a carpet. That could be possible. But what I wanted to make clear is that that Indian protocol is used all the time, also among the Dutch, to either express satisfaction or annoyance. But good to know that this is not supposed to be a carpet. So thank you for that.
I just wanted to remind our audience that if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box or raise your hand if you want to ask your question by voice, and we can get to you. So our first question in earnest is coming from Tara's iPhone. Tara, would you like to ask your question by voice?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Lennart, for uncovering the cover stories of history told by Indian sources and using other archived literature. And while this is very, very interesting, I'd like you to kind of expand a little more on the implications of this for history, because this is a universal phenomenon, this kind of court dynamics. And what, in specific, what does this particular instance have for Indian history or even a larger global history?
Yeah.
the way we look at it. I'd be very interested in the implications of this. Thank you.
Well, I wouldn't dare to speak about global history because I would move in all kinds of areas that I know very little about. But well, first of all, as I said, what I hear from fellow historians who work on early modern courts elsewhere in Eurasia and Africa, yeah, this idea or these findings that actually courtiers were very powerful and that there was always a lot of dynamics going on. That is what we find for many different courts now. But as for India, well, maybe one example is if you look at certain chronologies of dynasties, what you see is that the rulers are always each other's sons. So you have ruler so, and then he's succeeded by his son, and then that person is succeeded by his son, and so on and so on. There are many examples of that. That is, for instance, something I don't believe. I think, yeah, in reality, that must have proceeded in a very different way. Yeah, basically, I think, well, the problem maybe is a big word, but before the early modern period, you only have Indian sources that tell you part of the story. These sources were, of course, often produced under royal patronage or by Brahmins. So they give you a fairly one-sided view. And then if you combine it with external sources, you get a fuller picture of what was actually going on. Well, at least that is what I believe, and I hope I have convinced you to some extent. So what I think is that for these earlier periods of Indian history, the situation is actually quite different from what you could guess from Indian sources and what has been published now in secondary literature. But it's a problem that's very difficult to solve because before the year 1500, you have relatively few external sources. Yeah, is that sort of a short answer to your question?
Not completely, because
Okay.
I know what you're at. I mean, you've explained what you are doing. You're unearthing this kind of complexity in the court politics, but then what implication does that have for us, reading this kind of history?
Well, I think it also has an implication for our focus on kingship. Because that is also something that I would say is quite typical for Indian historiography, that very often it deals with kings and dynasties and, yeah, notions of kingship. And I also think that is really just one part of the story. And what we should try to do is focus much more on all these other people at the court, which will give us a better idea of the political situation. Is that closer to your question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Our next question comes from Shinoy, who asks about the role of platforms. In the mural, the ruler is on a platform, and we also have all of these very important architectural platforms. If you remember, the Mahanabni platform in Vijayanagara. So, what is the role of platforms? And
yeah, that's a nice question, because lots of these reports of these Dutch embassies to all these courts mention platforms. They are not all as grand as the one in Hampi, but there is usually a description of a kind of stepped platform under a canopy where the king is sitting. And what is really wonderful, I mean, I almost had included an example of that in today's talk, but yeah, I had only 45 minutes. But very often the Dutch describe in detail what the platform looks like, what the canopy looks like, how the king is dressed, with what kind of jewelry, and also who is allowed to sit where on the steps of the platform. So they often say, okay, on the top, how do you call it, step, on the highest level, there was courtier so and so, and there was a brother of the king, and then in the middle there was court merchant so and so. So you almost have like a visual representation of the various positions of these courtiers, because it also tells something about yeah, how prominent they were. And so the platform yeah, plays a very important role, and it's often mentioned in these Dutch sources.
So our next question is from Renu Parekh, and they are asking about the calendar systems that are used in the Dutch and Indian sources.
Well, I know very little about Indian calendar systems. I know that if you have the Shaka year, then you just have to yeah, add 78 years, and then you're in the Christian calendar. But I have also not needed. Yeah, it was not really necessary to work with this for my research. And the Dutch calendar system is just the Christian one. Yeah.
Now we have another very detail-oriented question from our co-host Helen,
Yeah.
who is asking about the meaning of the double-headed eagle that you find in many of the Nayaka period temples. Is it an emblem of royalty, and was it first used in the 17th or 18th centuries under the influence of Western courtly emblems or not? Helen asks.
Well, this is something I definitely not studied, which is not part of my research. But what I do know is that it's a very old symbol, and it has been used for millennia. And I think there's some literature on it. But I'm definitely not a specialist. I know it was a very important symbol for the Nayakas of Ikkeri, and it's depicted in one of their temples. So that I can say, and I think it's actually very old.
Yeah, we even find it on Seljuk monuments as well.
Yeah.
Where? Which monuments?
Seljuk monuments, Helen.
Yes, but Seljuks, we know the origins, but here, does it come from the Western context? Because this is also an emblem of royalty in Western courts.
Yeah, I have no idea. I can't tell you.
Okay.
I know it was important for the Nayakas of Ikkeri, but I'm not sure what is the yeah, the history of that particular symbol.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, so we have another person weighing in on the ancientness of the symbol. So if there are no further questions, please join me in thanking Professor Bes for this wonderful lecture and accepting our invitation for to deliver this lecture, especially given the fact that this is the 10-year anniversary of the DHF. So we should also be congratulating all of the team of the DHF, including Dr. Filon and Srikara and everybody else. And I would just like to say now that our next session, which will be Dr. Catherine Kastorf, just one second, and she will be speaking on monumental jinas and networks of prestige, Jain temples of the Hoysala capital, on October 22nd at 3 p.m. London time. And you can still register for that event if you have not already done so. So thank you very much for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your attention, and the Deccan Heritage Foundation for inviting me. It was really nice. Thanks.